The smoke woke me up before the alarm did. That's how fast it happened. 1 second I was asleep. The next I was sitting up in the dark with my nose telling me something was wrong before my eyes had even adjusted. I checked my phone. 2:51 a.m. I went to the bedroom window and looked south, and the horizon wasn't dark the way a July horizon in Oklahoma is supposed to be dark at 2:51 a.m. It was orange. Not a little orange. A lot of orange. I had my boots on before my wife Carol fully woke up. I told her, "Fire to the south, I'm going out." She said one word, "Go," and I was already down the stairs. My name is Garrett Pruett. I farm outside of Woodward, Oklahoma. Dryland winter wheat and grain sorghum, about 1,800 acres total. And on the south end of my operation, I've got a quarter section, 160 acres, of mature wheat that in late July of last year was sitting at exactly 11.2% moisture and about 4 days from harvest. The kind of wheat you work 9 months to grow. The kind of wheat that goes from golden to gone in a single bad night. In western Oklahoma, the wind is not weather. It's the baseline condition everything else happens against. On a calm day, and there aren't many, you notice its absence the way you notice silence in a loud room. Wheat farmers in this part of the state learn to read the wind the way sailors read the water. You know what 22 miles per hour feels like against your face. You know what 34 mph gusts do to a fire. The fire had started in the cedar breaks south of Highway 270, about 6 miles away. Somebody's burn pile from earlier in the week had rekindled in the wind. We'd had a sustained south wind all day at about 22 miles per hour, gusting to 34, the kind of wind that takes something small and makes it a problem fast. By the time it got to my fence line, it wasn't small anymore. I could hear it before I could see the flames clearly. That particular crackling rush that a grass fire makes when it's moving with the wind, like static electricity at a scale that kills things. I drove to the south field in my pickup and got out and stood at the gate and watched it for about 30 seconds. The fire was about a quarter mile south of my fence. Moving north at what I estimated was roughly half a mile per hour in the open pasture ground. The wind was pushing it directly at my wheat. My fence line ran east to west along the south edge of that quarter section, and behind that fence was 160 acres of 11.2% moisture wheat, standing 4 feet tall and dry as any fuel you could ask for. If that fire crossed my fence, I had maybe 10 minutes before the whole field was gone. I had one thing that could stop it. One. On the northwest corner of that quarter section, I run a Valley 8000 series center pivot irrigation system. The pivot covers 125 acres of the field. The center 125 acres, not the corners. It's a 1-in-300-foot radius machine, 7 spans of galvanized pipe on drive units, pulling from a 420-foot irrigation well at about 600 gallons per minute. The end gun on that pivot, when it's running at full pressure, throws water about 80 feet beyond the last span. Total wetted diameter, end gun included, roughly 1,320 feet. I had 40 minutes before that fire reached my fence. Maybe 45. If you've ever stood between a wildfire and something you can't afford to lose, stay right here. What I did over the next 43 minutes is not in any farming manual I've ever read. And the math at the end of it, that math still gives me a cold feeling when I think about it. Subscribe if you've ever had to improvise your way through something that wasn't supposed to happen. There are more of us out there than people know. Let me tell you about the pivot first, because the pivot is the story. The Valley 8000 series is a heavy-duty commercial irrigation system. My machine runs 7 spans. That's 7 sections of aluminum pipe supported by galvanized frame towers on rubber drive tires. Each span is about 185 feet long. From the center pivot point to the last tower is 1,115 feet, and then the overhang from the last tower to the end gun nozzle adds another 185 feet of pipe. The system covers 125 acres in one revolution, which at my typical irrigation speed of about 60%, takes roughly 18 hours to complete a full circle. The well that feeds it is a 420-foot vertical turbine pulling from the Ogallala Formation. At full throttle, the pump moves 600 gallons per minute. That's 36,000 gallons per hour through a 10-inch main line to the pivot. The operating pressure at the pivot point is 52 psi. When I run the end gun at full pressure, the outermost nozzle is throwing water in an arc that lands 80 feet beyond the last span. In irrigation terms, that's coverage. In fire defense terms, that's a wet line. There's a moment in any emergency when the noise in your head either organizes itself or it doesn't. I've had both kinds. The 2017 hailstorm that took 400 acres of grain sorghum an hour before harvest. Nothing to organize, nothing to do. This was different. The fire was a known quantity, moving at a known speed in a known direction. My field was a known geometry. The pivot had known capabilities. The question was whether those capabilities were sufficient for this specific geometry at 3:04 a.m. with 40 minutes left. I opened my notes app and started doing the math in my pickup headlights with the orange glow getting brighter to the south. My plan, such as it was at 3:04 a.m., was this. If I could get the pivot moving counterclockwise and angled so that the end gun was throwing water along the south fence line, I could lay down a wet strip across the path of the fire before it hit the fence. Not a fire break exactly. I didn't have time for a fire break. A wet zone. Wet enough that the fire would slow or stall when it hit the moisture, giving me time to think. The problem was the pivot's current position. When I'd shut it down the previous evening, the machine was parked with the last span sitting over the northeast corner of the field, pointing roughly 30 degrees east of due north. To get the end gun over the south fence line, I needed to rotate the machine about 200 degrees counterclockwise. From the northeast, sweeping west, south, and east until the arm was pointing due south. At 60% speed, that rotation would take about 12 hours. I didn't have 12 hours. I had 40 minutes. The Valley 8000 has a variable speed control. At maximum speed, 100%, the system moves roughly 3 times faster than at 60%. A full 360-degree rotation at 100% takes about 6 hours. 200 degrees of rotation at 100% is about 3.5 hours. Still not 40 minutes. But I didn't need 200 degrees. I needed the end gun to reach the south fence line, which meant I needed the last span of the pivot to be close enough to the south edge of the field that the end gun's 80-foot throw would reach the fence. The south edge of my field is 300 feet from the pivot point. My last span reaches to 1,115 feet. Add the end gun throw of 80 feet and I'm at 1,195 feet. The south fence is at 1,300 feet. I'm 105 feet short of the fence line with the end gun at standard throw. I called my irrigation equipment dealer at 3:07 a.m. His name is Dave Strickland. He answered on the third ring, which tells you something about irrigation dealers in western Oklahoma. I explained the situation in about 20 seconds. He said, "Put the end gun on the big nozzle, the storm nozzle, and open the pressure relief to 62 psi. That'll give you 95 to 100 feet of throw instead of 80. I said, "Will it damage the pump?" He said, "Not for one night. Do it." That gave me 1,210 feet of coverage, still 90 feet short of the fence line. But wheat fields have headers, end rows where equipment turns, and my south end rows were about 60 feet wide. Add the end row, and the wet zone from the pivot's end gun was going to reach within 30 feet of the standing fire side of the fence. 30 feet of dry wheat stubble between a wet field and a moving wildfire. That was what I had. The pivot was already running. I'd had it on a slow cycle for the week to keep the wheat from heat stressing before harvest. I cranked the speed to 100% from the panel at the pivot point and started it moving counterclockwise. Then I got back in my pickup and drove the fence line. Here's the other part of the plan. While the pivot was sweeping toward position, I was going to cut a fire line along the south fence with my tractor. A disc, dragged fast along the fence row, turning up bare mineral soil in a strip wide enough to slow the fire's advance. My John Deere 6R155, that's a 155 horsepower utility tractor, was sitting in the machine shed with a 15-foot disc on the hitch from a tillage job earlier in the week. I had mineral soil 6 inches down under that wheat stubble. If I could get that disc running along the fence before the fire arrived, a 15-foot strip of bare dirt might buy me the time I needed for the pivot to get into position. I drove back to the shed, hooked to the tractor without raising the cab steps, and had the disc in the ground at the southeast corner of the south field at 3:22 a.m. The fire was about 800 feet south of my fence by that point, moving. I could feel the heat from the cab, which means it was close enough that a shift in wind direction would have changed everything. The disc work took 11 minutes. One pass along the fence line, southeast corner to southwest corner, 15-foot strip, about 2,200 feet of run. The John Deere pulled it at 6 miles per hour, which is faster than I'd normally run a disc in July. The dust was significant, but I didn't have the luxury of being gentle with the soil that night. The strip came up pale and rough, about 15 feet wide, sitting between the wheat stubble and the fence. Bare dirt. By 3:38 a.m. the fire was at my fence line. Not close. At my fence line. I watched it from the cab of the John Deere as it hit the wire and the grass along the base of the fence caught. The fire ran east along the fence in the dry grass for about 200 feet before it reached the disked strip and slowed. Didn't stop. Slowed. The embers were still crossing into the stubble side on the wind. This was not over. I checked the pivot from my phone app. The Valley Command panel showed the last span at 247 degrees. That's the southwest quadrant, still about 60 degrees short of due south. At 100% speed, I had about 12 minutes before the end gun would be sweeping the south end rows. The longest 12 minutes I've spent on this farm. I know that sounds like something you say. I mean it the way you mean something when you're standing in a field at 3:45 in the morning with a fire moving north and a pivot moving south and a gap between them that is either going to close in time or it isn't. I had done everything I could think to do. The disc strip was laid. The pivot was at 100%. Dave's storm nozzle was throwing water 95 feet. The math said it would be close. The math had been saying that since 3 a.m. and close isn't a number you can farm with. Close is what you get when you wish you'd done something differently. I watched the fire work its way east along my fence line, eating the dry grass, throwing embers over the wire, and I watched the pivot arm swing south degree by degree in the app on my phone. And I thought about the 2017 hail, and I thought about what 160 acres of uninsured wheat would have meant to my operating note. And then I stopped thinking about those things, because they weren't useful. The fire crossed the fence on the east end of the disked strip, where the strip was thinnest and the wind was pushing hardest. It caught the wheat stubble on my side, the end rows, the dry material, and started moving north. Slowly, because the stubble was less fuel than standing wheat, but moving. At 3:51 a.m., the pivot's end gun swept across the south end rows for the first time. I watched it from 400 yards away. The water hit the ground in a fan pattern, 80 to 95 feet from the last span, laying down a moving wet line across the south end of the field. The fire hit that wet zone and did exactly what a fire does when it hits something it can't burn. It stopped, moved east, found dry material, kept going east until it hit the wet line again on the next sweep. The pivot was moving. The wet zone was moving with it. By 4:17 a.m., the fire had burned about 14 acres of my south end rows. The corners the pivot doesn't cover, the areas outside the wetted circle. I lost those acres, but the 125 acres under the pivot were untouched, wet, standing, alive. I sat in the cab of my John Deere in that field until the sun came up and the fire department arrived from Woodward about 40 minutes after I'd called them. The volunteer captain, a man named Bruce Alderman, who farms himself and understood immediately what had happened, walked the line with me at first light. He looked at the pivot, still running its slow counterclockwise sweep, laying water across the south end of the field. He looked at the burned acres on the corners. He looked at the standing wheat in the pivot circle. He said, "That was close," I said. "Yes, it was." He said, "What made you think of the storm nozzle?" I said, "I didn't. Dave Strickland did. I harvested that wheat 4 days later." The 125 acres under the pivot went 67 bushels per acre, which is above my farm average for that field. The 14 acres I lost to the fire went to the insurance adjuster and came back as a check that covered about 60 cents on the dollar of what the crop would have made. That's not a complaint. That's just how it goes. The volunteer fire crew stayed until 9 a.m. We walked the perimeter together when it was light enough to see clearly, and what we found was this. The fire had burned a ragged arc around the outside of the pivot circle, following the edge of what was wet and what wasn't, and had stopped at almost exactly the line where the end gun's water had reached. You could see it clearly in the stubble. Wet, standing wheat stubble on the inside of the arc, burned black on the outside. The pivot had drawn a line and the fire had respected it. What I learned that night isn't something I can easily summarize. It comes down to this. Know your equipment better than the emergency requires. Know the storm nozzle throw distance and the pressure rating, and where the speed control is at 3 in the morning when you can't turn on the lights, and think slowly. Know your ground and your field dimensions well enough to do the geometry in your head while a fire is moving toward your fence. Know Dave Strickland's cell number. And maybe most importantly, when something you can't control is moving towards something you can't afford to lose, don't stand at the fence and watch. Run your disc. Call your dealer. Turn your pivot to 100%. Do every single thing you can think of, in order, as fast as you can think of them. Some nights that's enough. Subscribe if this made you think about your own operation a little differently. Leave a comment. Tell me what emergency equipment you keep ready that most people don't think about. I read everyone. See you in the field.